Section 1 of Science and the Modern World by Alfred Whitehead. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. The Origins of Modern Science. The progress of civilization is not wholly a uniform drift towards better things. It may perhaps wear this aspect if we map it on a scale which is large enough. But such broad views obscure the details on which rest our whole understanding of the process. New epochs emerge with comparative suddenness, if we have regard to the scores of thousands of years throughout which the complete history extends. Secluded races suddenly take their places in the mainstream of events. Technological discoveries transform the mechanism of human life. A primitive art quickly flowers into full satisfaction of some aesthetic craving. Great religions in their crusading youth spread through the nations the peace of heaven and the sword of the Lord. The 16th century of our era saw the disruption of Western Christianity and the rise of modern science. It was an age of ferment. Nothing was settled, though much was opened, new worlds and new ideas. In science, Copernicus and Vesalius may be chosen as representative figures. They typify the new cosmology and the scientific emphasis on direct observation. Giordano Bruno was the martyr, but the cause for which he suffered was not that of science, but that of free imaginative speculation. His death in the year 1600 ushered in the first century of modern science in the strict sense of the term. In his execution there was an unconscious symbolism, for the subsequent tone of scientific thought has contained distrust of his type of general speculativeness. The Reformation, for all its importance, may be considered as a domestic affair of the European races. Even the Christianity of the East viewed it with profound disengagement. Furthermore, such disruptions are no new phenomena in the history of Christianity or of other religions. When we project this great revolution upon the whole history of the Christian Church, we cannot look upon it as introducing a new principle into human life. For good or for evil, it was a great transformation of religion, but it was not the coming of religion. It did not itself claim to be so. Reformers maintained that they were only restoring what had been forgotten. It is quite otherwise with the rise of modern science. In every way it contrasts with the contemporary religious movement. The Reformation was a popular uprising, and for a century and a half drenched Europe in blood. The beginnings of the scientific movement were confined to a minority among the intellectual elite. In a generation which saw the 30 Years' War and remembered Alva in the Netherlands, the worst that happened to men of science was that Galileo suffered an honourable detention and a mild reproof before dying peacefully in his bed. The way in which the persecution of Galileo has been remembered is a tribute to the quiet commencement of the most intimate change in outlook which the human race had yet encountered. Since a babe was born in a manger, it may be doubted whether so great a thing has happened with so little stir. The thesis which these lectures will illustrate is that this quiet growth of science has practically recoloured our mentality, so that modes of thought which in former times were exceptional are now broadly spread through the educated world. This new colouring of ways of thought had been proceeding slowly for many ages in the European peoples. At last it issued in the rapid development of science, and has thereby strengthened itself by its most obvious application. The new mentality is more important even than the new science and the new technology. It has altered the metaphysical presuppositions and the imaginative contents of our minds, so that now the old stimuli provoke a new response. Perhaps my metaphor of a new colour is too strong. What I mean is just that slightest change of tone which yet makes all the difference. This is exactly illustrated by a sentence from a published letter of that adorable genius, William James. When he was finishing his great treatise on the principles of psychology, he wrote to his brother Henry James, "I have to forge every sentence in the teeth of irreducible and stubborn facts." This new tinge to modern minds is a vehement and passionate interest in the relation of general principles to irreducible and stubborn facts. All the world over and at all times there have been practical men absorbed in irreducible and stubborn facts. All the world over and at all times there have been men of philosophic temperament who have been absorbed in the weaving of general principles. It is this union of passionate interest in the detailed facts, with equal devotion to abstract generalization, which forms the novelty in our present society. Previously it had appeared sporadically and as if by chance. This balance of mind has now become part of the tradition which infects cultivated thought. It is the salt which keeps life sweet. The main business of universities is to transmit this tradition as a widespread inheritance from generation to generation. Another contrast which singles out science from among the European movements of the 16th and 17th centuries is its universality. Modern science was born in Europe, but its home is the whole world. In the last 2 centuries there has been a long and confused impact of Western modes upon the civilization of Asia. The wise men of the East have been puzzling, and are puzzling, as to what may be the regulative secret of life which can be passed from West to East without the wanton destruction of their own inheritance which they so rightly prize. More and more it is becoming evident that what the West can most readily give to the East is its science and its scientific outlook. This is transferable from country to country and from race to race, wherever there is a rational society. In this course of lectures I shall not discuss the details of scientific discovery. My theme is the energizing of a state of mind in the modern world, its broad generalizations, and its impact upon other spiritual forces. There are 2 ways of reading history, forwards and backwards. In the history of thought we require both methods. A climate of opinion, to use the happy phrase of a 17th century writer, requires for its understanding the consideration of its antecedents and its issues. Accordingly, in this lecture I shall consider some of the antecedents of our modern approach to the investigation of nature. In the first place, there can be no living science unless there is a widespread instinctive conviction in the existence of an order of things, and in particular of an order of nature. I have used the word instinctive advisedly. It does not matter what men say in words, so long as their activities are controlled by settled instincts. The words may ultimately destroy the instincts, but until this has occurred, words do not count. This remark is important in respect to the history of scientific thought. For we shall find that since the time of Hume, the fashionable scientific philosophy has been such as to deny the rationality of science. This conclusion lies upon the surface of Hume's philosophy. Take, for example, the following passage from section 4 of his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. In a word, then, every effect is a distinct event from its cause. It could not therefore be discovered in the cause, and the first invention or conception of it, a priori, must be entirely arbitrary. If the cause in itself discloses no information as to the effect, so that the first invention of it must be entirely arbitrary, it follows at once that science is impossible, except in the sense of establishing entirely arbitrary connections which are not warranted by anything intrinsic to the natures either of causes or effects. Some variant of Hume's philosophy has generally prevailed among men of science, but scientific faith has risen to the occasion and has tacitly removed the philosophic mountain. In view of this strange contradiction in scientific thought, it is of the first importance to consider the antecedents of a faith which is impervious to the demand for a consistent rationality. We have therefore to trace the rise of the instinctive faith that there is an order of nature which can be traced in every detailed occurrence. Of course we all share in this faith, and we therefore believe that the reason for the faith is our apprehension of its truth. But the formation of a general idea, such as the idea of the order of nature, and the grasp of its importance, and the observation of its exemplification in a variety of occasions, are by no means the necessary consequences of the truth of the idea in question. Familiar things happen, and mankind does not bother about them. It requires a very unusual mind to undertake the analysis of the obvious. Accordingly, I wish to consider the stages in which this analysis became explicit, and finally became unalterably impressed upon the educated minds of Western Europe. Obviously, the main recurrences of life are too insistent to escape the notice of the least rational of humans, and even before the dawn of rationality, they have impressed themselves upon the instincts of animals. It is unnecessary to labour the point that in broad outline certain general states of nature recur, and that our very natures have adapted themselves to such repetitions. But there is a complementary fact which is equally true and equally obvious. Nothing ever really recurs in exact detail. No 2 days are identical, no 2 winters. What has gone forever. Accordingly, the practical philosophy of mankind has been to expect the broad recurrences, and to accept the details as emanating from the inscrutable womb of things, beyond the ken of rationality. Men expected the sun to rise, but the wind bloweth where it listeth. Certainly from the classical Greek civilization onwards there have been men, and indeed groups of men, who have placed themselves beyond this acceptance of an ultimate irrationality. Such men have endeavoured to explain all phenomena as the outcome of an order of things which extends to every detail. Geniuses such as Aristotle or Archimedes or Roger Bacon must have been endowed with the full scientific mentality, which instinctively holds that all things great and small are conceivable as exemplifications of general principles which reign throughout the natural order. But until the close of the Middle Ages, the general educated public did not feel that intimate conviction and that detailed interest in such an idea, so as to lead to an unceasing supply of men with ability and opportunity adequate to maintain a coordinated search for the discovery of these hypothetical principles. Either people were doubtful about the existence of such principles, or were doubtful about any success in finding them, or took no interest in thinking about them, or were oblivious to their practical importance when found. For whatever reason, search was languid, if we have regard to the opportunities of a high civilization and the length of time concerned. Why did the pace suddenly quicken in the 16th and 17th centuries? At the close of the Middle Ages, a new mentality discloses itself. Invention stimulated thought. Thought quickened physical speculation. Greek manuscripts disclosed what the ancients had discovered. Finally, although in the year 1500 Europe knew less than Archimedes, who died in the year 212 BC, yet in the year 1700 Newton's Principia had been written and the world was well started on the modern epoch. There have been great civilizations in which the peculiar balance of mind required for science has only fitfully appeared and has produced the feeblest result. For example, the more we know of Chinese art, of Chinese literature, and of the Chinese philosophy of life, the more we admire the heights to which that civilization attained. For thousands of years there have been in China acute and learned men patiently devoting their lives to study. Having regard to the span of time and to the population concerned, China forms the largest volume of civilization which the world has seen. There is no reason to doubt the intrinsic capacity of individual Chinamen for the pursuit of science. And yet Chinese science is practically negligible. There is no reason to believe that China, if left to itself, would have ever produced any progress in science. The same may be said of India. Furthermore, if the Persians had enslaved the Greeks, there is no definite ground for belief that science would have flourished in Europe. The Romans showed no particular originality in that line. Even as it was, the Greeks, though they founded the movement, did not sustain it with the concentrated interest which modern Europe has shown. I am not alluding to the last few generations of the European peoples on both sides of the ocean. I mean the smaller Europe of the Reformation period, distracted as it was with wars and religious disputes. Consider the world of the Eastern Mediterranean, from Sicily to Western Asia, during the period of about 1400 years from the death of Archimedes, in 212 BC, to the eruption of the Tartars. There were wars and revolutions and large changes of religion, but nothing much worse than the wars of the 16th and 17th centuries throughout Europe. There was a great and wealthy civilization, pagan, Christian, Mahometan. In that period a great deal was added to science, but on the whole the progress was slow and wavering, and except in mathematics, the men of the Renaissance practically started from the position which Archimedes had reached. There had been some progress in medicine and some progress in astronomy, but the total advance was very little compared to the marvellous success of the 17th century. For example, compare the progress of scientific knowledge from the year 1560, just before the births of Galileo and of Kepler, up to the year 1700, when Newton was in the height of his fame, with the progress in the ancient period, already mentioned, exactly 10 times as long. Nevertheless, Greece was the mother of Europe, and it is to Greece that we must look in order to find the origin of our modern ideas. We all know that on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean there was a very flourishing school of Ionian philosophers, deeply interested in theories concerning nature. Their ideas have been transmitted to us, enriched by the genius of Plato and Aristotle. But with the exception of Aristotle, and it is a large exception, this school of thought has not attained to the complete scientific mentality. In some ways it was better. The Greek genius was philosophical, lucid, and logical. The men of this group were primarily asking philosophical questions. What is the substratum of nature? Is it fire, or earth, or water, or some combination of any two or of all three? Or is it a mere flux, not reducible to some static material? Mathematics interested them mightily. They invented its generality, analysed its premises, and made notable discoveries of theorems by a rigid adherence to deductive reasoning. Their minds were infected with an eager generality. They demanded clear, bold ideas and strict reasoning from them. All this was excellent, it was genius, It was ideal preparatory work, but it was not science as we understand it. The patience of minute observation was not nearly so prominent. Their genius was not so apt for the state of imaginative muddled suspense which precedes successful inductive generalization. They were lucid thinkers and bold reasoners. Of course, there were exceptions, and at the very top, for example, Aristotle and Archimedes. Also, for patient observation, there were the astronomers. There was a mathematical lucidity about the stars, and a fascination about the small numerable band of runaway planets. Every philosophy is tinged with the colouring of some secret imaginative background, which never emerges explicitly into its trains of reasoning. The Greek view of nature, at least that cosmology transmitted from them to later ages, was essentially dramatic. It is not necessarily wrong for this reason, but it was overwhelmingly dramatic. It thus conceived nature as articulated in the way of a work of dramatic art, for the exemplification of general ideas converging to an end. Nature was differentiated so as to provide its proper end for each thing. There was the centre of the universe as the end of motion for those things which are heavy, and the celestial spheres as the end of motion for those things whose natures lead them upwards. The celestial spheres were for things which are impassable and ingenerable, the lower regions for things impassable and generable. Nature was a drama in which each thing played its part. I do not say that this is a view to which Aristotle would have subscribed without severe reservations, in fact without the sort of reservations which we ourselves would make. But it was the view which subsequent Greek thought extracted from Aristotle and passed on to the Middle Ages. The effect of such an imaginative setting for nature was to damp down the historical spirit, for it was the end which seemed illuminating, so why bother about the beginning? The Reformation and the scientific movement were two aspects of the historical revolt which was the dominant intellectual movement of the later Renaissance. The appeal to the origins of Christianity and Francis Bacon's appeal to efficient causes as against final causes were two sides of one movement of thought. Also for this reason Galileo and his adversaries were at hopeless cross purposes, as can be seen from his dialogues on the two systems of the world. Galileo keeps harping on how things happen, whereas his adversaries had a complete theory as to why things happen. Unfortunately, the two theories did not bring out the same results. Galileo insists upon irreducible and stubborn facts, and Simplicius, his opponent, brings forward reasons, completely satisfactory, at least to himself. It is a great mistake to conceive this historical revolt as an appeal to reason. On the contrary, it was through and through an anti-intellectualist movement. It was the return to the contemplation of brute fact, and it was based on a recoil from the inflexible rationality of medieval thought. In making this statement, I am merely summarizing what at the time the adherents of the old regime themselves asserted. For example, in the fourth book of Father Paul Sarpi's History of the Council of Trent, you will find that in the year 1551 the papal legates who presided over the council ordered that the divines ought to confirm their opinions with the Holy Scripture, traditions of the apostles, sacred and approved councils, and by the constitutions and authorities of the Holy Fathers, that they ought to use brevity and avoid superfluous and unprofitable questions and perverse contentions. This order did not please the Italian divines, who said it was a novity and a condemning of school divinity, which in all difficulties useth reason, and because it was not lawful, that is by this decree, to treat as St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, and other famous men did. It is impossible not to feel sympathy with these Italian divines, maintaining the lost cause of unbridled rationalism. They were deserted on all hands. The Protestants were in full revolt against them. The papacy failed to support them, and the bishops of the council could not even understand them. For a few sentences below the foregoing quotation, we read, "Though many complained hereof," that is of the decree, "yet it prevailed but little, because generally the fathers," that is the bishops, "desired to hear men speak with intelligible terms, not abstrusely, as in the matter of justification and others already handled." Poor belated medievalists! When they used reason, they were not even intelligible to the ruling powers of their epoch. It will take centuries before stubborn facts are reducible by reason, and meanwhile the pendulum swings slowly and heavily to the extreme of the historical method. 43 years after the Italian divines had written this memorial, Richard Hooker, in his famous Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, makes exactly the same complaint of his Puritan adversaries. Hooker's balanced thought, from which the appellation the judicious hooker is derived, and his diffuse style, which is the vehicle of such thought, make his writings singularly unfit for the process of summarizing by a short, pointed quotation. But in the section referred to he reproaches his opponents with their disparagement of reason, and in support of his own position definitively refers to the greatest among the school divines, by which designation I presume that he refers to St. Thomas Aquinas. Hooker's Ecclesiastical Polity was published just before Sarpi's Council of Trent. Accordingly, there was complete independence between the two works. But both the Italian divines of 1551 and Hooker at the end of that century testify to the anti-rationalist trend of thought at that epoch, and in this respect contrast their own age with the epoch of scholasticism. This reaction was undoubtedly a very necessary corrective to the unguarded rationalism of the Middle Ages. But reactions run to extremes. Accordingly, although one outcome of this reaction was the birth of modern science, yet we must remember that science thereby inherited the bias of thought to which it owes its origin. The effect of Greek dramatic literature was many-sided so far as concerns the various ways in which it indirectly affected medieval thought. The pilgrim fathers of the scientific imagination as it exists today are the great tragedians of ancient Athens, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Their vision of fate, remorseless and indifferent, urging a tragic incident to its inevitable issue, is the vision possessed by science. Fate in Greek tragedy becomes the order of nature in modern thought. The absorbing interest in the particular heroic incidents, as an example and a verification of the workings of fate, reappears in our epoch as concentration of interest on the crucial experiments. It was my good fortune to be present at the meeting of the Royal Society in London when the Astronomer Royal for England announced that the photographic plates of the famous eclipse, as measured by his colleagues in Greenwich Observatory, had verified the prediction of Einstein that rays of light are bent as they pass in the neighbourhood of the sun. The whole atmosphere of tense interest was exactly that of the Greek drama. We were the chorus commenting on the decree of destiny as disclosed in the development of a supreme incident. There was dramatic quality in the very staging, the traditional ceremonial, and in the background the picture of Newton to remind us that the greatest of scientific generalizations was now, after more than 2 centuries, to receive its first modification. Nor was the personal interest wanting. A great adventure in thought had at length come safe to shore. Let me here remind you that the essence of dramatic tragedy is not unhappiness. It resides in the solemnity of the remorseless working of things. This inevitableness of destiny can only be illustrated in terms of human life by incidents which in fact involve unhappiness. For it is only by them that the futility of escape can be made evident in the drama. This remorseless inevitableness is what pervades scientific thought. The laws of physics are the decrees of fate. The conception of the moral order in the Greek plays was certainly not a discovery of the dramatists. It must have passed into the literary tradition from the general serious opinion of the times. But in finding this magnificent expression, it thereby deepened the stream of thought from which it arose. The spectacle of a moral order was impressed upon the imagination of classical civilization. The time came when that great society decayed, and Europe passed into the Middle Ages. The direct influence of Greek literature vanished. But the concept of the moral order and of the order of nature had enshrined itself in the Stoic philosophy. For example, Lecky in his History of European Morals tells us, Seneca maintains that the divinity has determined all things by an inexorable law of destiny, which he has decreed, but which he himself obeys. But the most effective way in which the Stoics influenced the mentality of the Middle Ages was by the diffused sense of order which arose from Roman law. Again to quote Lecky, the Roman legislation was in a twofold manner the child of philosophy. It was in the first place formed upon the philosophical model, for instead of being a mere empirical system adjusted to the existing requirements of society, it laid down abstract principles of right to which it endeavoured to conform. And in the next place, these principles were borrowed directly from Stoicism. In spite of the actual anarchy throughout large regions in Europe after the collapse of the Empire, the sense of legal order always haunted the racial memories of the imperial populations. Also, the Western Church was always there as a living embodiment of the traditions of imperial rule. It is important to notice that this legal impress upon medieval civilization was not in the form of a few wise precepts which should permeate conduct. It was the conception of a definite articulated system which defines the legality of the detailed structure of social organism and of the detailed way in which it should function. There was nothing vague. It was not a question of admirable maxims, but of definite procedure to put things right and to keep them there. The Middle Ages formed one long training of the intellect of Western Europe in the sense of order. There may have been some deficiency in respect to practice, but the idea never for a moment lost its grip. It was preeminently an epoch of orderly thought, rationalist through and through. The very anarchy quickened the sense for coherent system, just as the modern anarchy of Europe has stimulated the intellectual vision of a League of Nations. But for science something more is wanted than a general sense of the order in things. It needs but a sentence to point out how the habit of definite exact thought was implanted in the European mind by the long dominance of scholastic logic and scholastic divinity. The habit remained after the philosophy had been repudiated, the priceless habit of looking for an exact point and of sticking to it when found. Galileo owes more to Aristotle than appears on the surface of his dialogues. He owes to him his clear head and his analytic mind. I do not think, however, that I have even yet brought out the greatest contribution of medievalism to the formation of the scientific movement. I mean the inexpugnable belief that every detailed occurrence can be correlated with its antecedents in a perfectly definite manner, exemplifying general principles. Without this belief, the incredible labours of scientists would be without hope. It is this instinctive conviction, vividly poised before the imagination, which is the motive power of research, that there is a secret which can be unveiled. How has this conviction been so vividly implanted on the European mind? When we compare this tone of thought in Europe with the attitude of other civilizations when left to themselves, there seems but one source for its origin. It must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God, conceived as with the personal energy of Jehovah and with the rationality of a Greek philosopher. Every detail was supervised and ordered. The search into nature could only result in the vindication of the faith in rationality. Remember that I am not talking of the explicit beliefs of a few individuals. What I mean is the impress on the European mind arising from the unquestioned faith of centuries. By this I mean the instinctive tone of thought and not a mere creed of words. In Asia, the conceptions of God were of a being who was either too arbitrary or too impersonal for such ideas to have much effect on instinctive habits of mind. Any definite occurrence might be due to the fiat of an irrational despot, or might issue from some impersonal, inscrutable origin of things. There was not the same confidence as in the intelligible rationality of a personal being. I am not arguing that the European trust in the scrutability of nature was logically justified even by its own theology. My only point is to understand how it arose. My explanation is that the faith in the possibility of science, generated antecedently to the development of modern scientific theory, is an unconscious derivative from medieval theology. But science is not merely the outcome of instinctive faith. It also requires an active interest in the simple occurrences of life for their own sake. This qualification, for their own sake, is important. The first phase of the Middle Ages was an age of symbolism. It was an age of vast ideas and of primitive technique. There was little to be done with nature except to coin a hard living from it. But there were realms of thought to be explored, realms of philosophy and realms of theology. Primitive art could symbolize those ideas which filled all thoughtful minds. The first phase of medieval art has a haunting charm beyond compare. Its own intrinsic quality is enhanced by the fact that its message, which stretched beyond art's own self-justification of aesthetic achievement, was the symbolism of things lying behind nature itself. In this symbolic phase, medieval art energized in nature as its medium, but pointed to another world. In order to understand the contrast between these early Middle Ages and the atmosphere required by the scientific mentality, we should compare the 6th century in Italy with the 16th century. In both centuries, the Italian genius was laying the foundations of a new epoch. The history of the 3 centuries preceding the earlier period, despite the promise for the future introduced by the rise of Christianity, is overwhelmingly infected by the sense of the decline of civilization. In each generation, something has been lost. As we read the records, we are haunted by the shadow of the coming barbarism. There are great men, with fine achievements in action or in thought, but their total effect is merely for some short time to arrest the general decline. In the 6th century we are, so far as Italy is concerned, at the lowest point of the curve. But in that century every action is laying the foundation for the tremendous rise of the new European civilization. In the background, the Byzantine Empire, under Justinian, in three ways determined the character of the early Middle Ages in Western Europe. In the first place, its armies, under Belisarius and Narses, cleared Italy from the Gothic domination. In this way the stage was freed for the exercise of the old Italian genius for creating organizations which shall be protective of ideals of cultural activity. It is impossible not to sympathize with the Goths. Yet there can be no doubt that 1,000 years of the papacy were infinitely more valuable for Europe than any effects derivable from a well-established Gothic kingdom of Italy. In the second place, the codification of the Roman law established the ideal of legality which dominated the sociological thought of Europe in the succeeding centuries. Law is both an engine for government and a condition restraining government. The canon law of the Church and the civil law of the state owe to Justinian's lawyers their influence on the development of Europe. They established in the Western mind the ideal that an authority should be at once lawful and law-enforcing, and should in itself exhibit a rationally adjusted system of organization. The 6th century in Italy gave the initial exhibition of the way in which the impress of these ideas was fostered by contact with the Byzantine Empire. Thirdly, in the non-political spheres of art and learning, Constantinople exhibited a standard of realized achievement which, partly by the impulse to direct imitation, and partly by the indirect inspiration arising from the mere knowledge that such things existed, acted as a perpetual spur to Western culture. The wisdom of the Byzantines, as it stood in the imagination of the first phase of medieval mentality, and the wisdom of the Egyptians as it stood in the imagination of the early Greeks, played analogous roles. Probably the actual knowledge of these respective wisdoms was, in either case, about as much as was good for the recipients. They knew enough to know the sort of standards which are attainable, and not enough to be fettered by static and traditional ways of thought. Accordingly, in both cases men went ahead on their own and did better. No account of the rise of European scientific mentality can omit some notice of this influence of the Byzantine civilization in the background. In the 6th century there is a crisis in the history of the relations between the Byzantines and the West. And this crisis is to be contrasted with the influence of Greek literature on European thought in the 15th and 16th centuries. The two outstanding men who in the Italy of the 6th century laid the foundations of the future were St. Benedict and Gregory the Great. By reference to them we can at once see how absolutely in ruins was the approach to the scientific mentality which had been attained by the Greeks. We are at the 0 point of scientific temperature. But the life-work of Gregory and of Benedict contributed elements to the reconstruction of Europe, which secured that this reconstruction, when it arrived, should include a more effective scientific mentality than that of the ancient world. The Greeks were over-theoretical. For them science was an offshoot of philosophy. Gregory and Benedict were practical men, with an eye for the importance of ordinary things, and they combined this practical temperament with their religious and cultural activities. In particular, we owe it to St. Benedict that the monasteries were the homes of practical agriculturalists, as well as of saints and of artists, and of men of learning. The alliance of science with technology, by which learning is kept in contact with irreducible and stubborn facts, owes much to the practical bent of the early Benedictines. Modern science derives from Rome as well as from Greece, and this Roman strain explains its gain in an energy of thought kept closely in contact with the world of facts. But the influence of this contact between the monasteries and the facts of nature showed itself first in art. The rise of naturalism in the later Middle Ages was the entry into the European mind of the final ingredient necessary for the rise of science. It was the rise of interest in natural objects and in natural occurrences for their own sakes. The natural foliage of a district was sculptured in out-of-the-way spots of the later buildings, merely as exhibiting delight in those familiar objects. The whole atmosphere of every art exhibited a direct joy in the apprehension of the things which lie around us. The craftsmen who executed the late medieval decorative sculpture, Giotto, Chaucer, Wordsworth, Walt Whitman, and at the present day the New England poet Robert Frost, are all akin to each other in this respect. The simple immediate facts are the topics of interest, and these reappear in the thought of science as the irreducible stubborn facts. The mind of Europe was now prepared for its new venture of thought. It is unnecessary to tell in detail the various incidents which marked the rise of science. The growth of wealth and leisure, the expansion of universities, the invention of printing, the taking of Constantinople, Copernicus, Vasco da Gama, Columbus, the telescope. The soil, the climate, the seeds were there, and the forest grew. Science has never shaken off the impress of its origin in the historical revolt of the later Renaissance. It has remained predominantly an anti-rationalistic movement, based upon a naive faith. What reasoning it has wanted has been borrowed from mathematics, which is a surviving relic of Greek rationalism, following the deductive method. Science repudiates philosophy. In other words, it has never cared to justify its faith or to explain its meanings, and has remained blandly indifferent to its refutation by Hume. Of course, the historical revolt was fully justified. It was wanted. It was more than wanted. It was an absolute necessity for healthy progress. The world required centuries of contemplation of irreducible and stubborn facts. It is difficult for men to do more than one thing at a time, and that was the sort of thing they had to do after the rationalistic orgy of the Middle Ages. It was a very sensible reaction, but it was not a protest on behalf of reason. There is, however, a nemesis which waits upon those who deliberately avoid avenues of knowledge. Oliver Cromwell's cry echoes down the ages. My brethren, by the bowels of Christ I beseech you, bethink you that you may be mistaken. The progress of science has now reached a turning point. The stable foundations of physics have broken up. Also, for the first time, physiology is asserting itself as an effective body of knowledge, as distinct from a scrap heap. The old foundations of scientific thought are becoming unintelligible. Time, space, matter, material, ether, electricity, mechanism, organism, configuration, structure, pattern, function, all require reinterpretation. What is the sense of talking about a mechanical explanation when you do not know what you mean by mechanics? The truth is that science started its modern career by taking over ideas derived from the weakest side of the philosophies of Aristotle's successors. In some respects it was a happy choice. It enabled the knowledge of the 17th century to be formularized so far as physics and chemistry were concerned, with a completeness which has lasted to the present time. But the progress of biology and psychology has probably been checked by the uncritical assumption of half-truths. If science is not to degenerate into a medley of ad hoc hypotheses, it must become philosophical and must enter upon a thorough criticism of its own foundations. In the succeeding lectures of this course, I shall trace the successes and the failures of the particular conceptions of cosmology with which the European intellect has clothed itself in the last 3 centuries. General climates of opinion persist for periods of about 2 or 3 generations, that is to say, for periods of 60 to 100 years. There are also shorter waves of thought which play on the surface of the tidal movement. We shall find, therefore, transformations in the European outlook, slowly modifying the successive centuries. There persists, however, throughout the whole period the fixed scientific cosmology, which presupposes the ultimate fact of an irreducible brute matter, or material, spread throughout space in a flux of configurations. In itself such a material is senseless, valueless, purposeless. It just does what it does do, following a fixed routine imposed by external relations which do not spring from the nature of its being. It is this assumption that I call scientific materialism. Also, it is an assumption which I shall challenge as being entirely unsuited to the scientific situation at which we have now arrived. It is not wrong if properly construed. If we confine ourselves to certain types of facts, abstracted from the complete circumstances in which they occur, the materialistic assumption expresses these facts to perfection. But when we pass beyond the abstraction, either by more subtle employment of our senses, or by the request for meanings and for coherence of thoughts, the scheme breaks down at once. The narrow efficiency of the scheme was the very cause of its supreme methodological success, for it directed attention to just those groups of facts which, in the state of knowledge then existing, required investigation. The success of the scheme has adversely affected the various currents of European thought. The historical revolt was anti-rationalistic because the rationalism of the scholastics required a sharp correction by contact with brute fact. But the revival of philosophy in the hands of Descartes and his successors was entirely coloured in its development by the acceptance of the scientific cosmology at its face value. The success of their ultimate ideas confirmed scientists in their refusal to modify them as the result of an inquiry into their rationality. Every philosophy was bound in some way or other to swallow them whole. Also the example of science affected other regions of thought. The historical revolt has thus been exaggerated into the exclusion of philosophy from its proper role of harmonizing the various abstractions of methodological thought. Thought is abstract, and the intolerant use of abstractions is the major vice of the intellect. This vice is not wholly corrected by the recurrence to concrete experience, for after all you need only attend to those aspects of your concrete experience which lie within some limited scheme. There are two methods for the purification of ideas. One of them is dispassionate observation by means of the bodily senses. But observation is selection. Accordingly, it is difficult to transcend a scheme of abstraction whose success is sufficiently wide. The other method is by comparing the various schemes of abstraction which are well founded in our various types of experience. This comparison takes the form of satisfying the demands of the Italian scholastic divines whom Paul Sarpi mentioned. They asked that reason should be used. Faith in reason is the trust that the ultimate natures of things lie together in a harmony which excludes mere arbitrariness. It is the faith that at the base of things we shall not find mere arbitrary mystery. The faith in the order of nature which has made possible the growth of science is a particular example of a deeper faith. This faith cannot be justified by any inductive generalization. It springs from direct inspection of the nature of things as disclosed in our own immediate present experience. There is no parting from your own shadow. To experience this faith is to know that in being ourselves we are more than ourselves, to know that our experience, dim and fragmentary as it is, yet sounds the utmost depths of reality, to know that detached details, merely in order to be themselves, demand that they should find themselves in a system of things, to know that this system includes the harmony of logical rationality and the harmony of aesthetic achievement, to know that, while the harmony of logic lies upon the universe as an iron necessity, the aesthetic harmony stands before it as a living ideal moulding the general flux in its broken progress towards finer, subtler issues. End of section 1.